History isn't just written by the living. Sometimes it is decided by the power of a dead man. His name was Prince Wilhelm of Prussia. He renounced his claim to an empire, all for love. He was born to rule, but chose to live as a romantic. Fate, however, forced him to die as a soldier, an unknown lieutenant in the army of the very men who had destroyed his family's throne. In life, he was merely a shadow of the past, a name all but forgotten. But in death, this forgotten prince became more dangerous to the Third Reich than any armored division. His funeral became a silent rebellion of 50,000 souls, a declaration of war made not with the roar of cannons, but with the deafening sound of a forbidden memory. To comprehend the profound tragedy of the man who lay in the coffin in Potsdam in 1940, one must first journey back to the world into which he was born. A world that, viewed from the fractured landscape of the mid-20th century, seemed as remote and fantastical as a lost civilization. It was a world of seemingly unshakable certainties, of rigid hierarchies, and of immense explosive power. On the 4th of July, 1906, the German Empire, the Second Reich, stood at the absolute zenith of its influence and prestige. Forged only 35 years earlier in the crucible of war, out of a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and principalities under the iron will of Prussia, Germany was the new titan of Europe. It was a nation crackling with energy, a young and ambitious empire determined to claim what its ruler, Kaiser Wilhelm II, famously called its place in the sun. This Wilhelmina Germany was a land of staggering contrasts. It was a powerhouse of industry, its factories, in the Ruhr Valley belching smoke and fire, producing more steel than Britain and France combined. Its chemical and electrical industries led the world, with names like Siemens, Bayer, and BASF becoming global symbols of innovation. German universities were the envy of the academic world, their laboratories and lecture halls producing a constant stream of Nobel laureates in physics, chemistry, and medicine. At the same time, it was a society steeped in a deeply romanticized, almost medieval vision of the past. Its social structure was a rigid pyramid, with the landed aristocracy, the Junkers of Prussia, at its apex, followed by a powerful officer corps, an expanding and prosperous bourgeoisie, and a vast, increasingly organized working class. It was an authoritarian state, a semi-constitutional monarchy where the elected parliament, the Reichstag, held the power of the purse, but where real authority rested with the emperor and his hand-picked chancellor. The soul of this empire was militarism. The Prussian army, with its legendary general staff and its iron tradition of discipline and duty, Pflichtgefühl, was not just a branch of the state, it was the state's central pillar, the school of the nation. Society was saturated with its values. Uniforms were everywhere, and the status of an officer often outranked that of a wealthy industrialist. This terrestrial might was now being challenged by the Kaiser's personal obsession, the creation of a massive high-seas fleet, a direct and provocative challenge to Great Britain's centuries-long naval supremacy. This naval race, fueled by intense nationalism and industrial pride, created a palpable tension across the continent, a sense that this dynamic new empire was a force that would inevitably disrupt the old order of Europe. This was the world awaiting its new heir. On that hot July day in 1906, within the idyllic neoclassical walls of the Marmor Palais, or Marble Palace in Potsdam, the cannon salutes began to thunder. 101 shots, the traditional salute for the birth of a prince in the direct line of succession, echoed across the placid waters of the Heiliger Sea Lake and rolled through the meticulously manicured gardens of Sanssouci. Church bells across the Kingdom of Prussia and throughout the German Empire pealed in celebration. The child, the firstborn son of Crown Prince Wilhelm and Crown Princess Cecilia, had arrived. He was named Friedrich Wilhelm Victor August Ernst, a litany of names that were a testament to his Hohenzollern and Prussian heritage. Friedrich Wilhelm linked him directly to the soldier king and to Frederick the Great, the foundational figures of Prussian power and prestige. From the very moment he drew his first breath, his destiny seemed as solid and immutable as the granite walls of the palaces he would call home. He was second in line to the German and Prussian thrones after his father. He was the future. His grandfather, the reigning emperor, was Kaiser Wilhelm II, the dominant and defining figure of the era. To understand the young prince's childhood is to understand the immense gravitational pull of this complex, brilliant, and deeply flawed man. The Kaiser was the embodiment of his empire's contradictions. He was intelligent, well-read, and possessed of a quick, if often superficial grasp of many subjects. He was also notoriously impulsive, arrogant, and emotionally volatile. Plagued by a profound insecurity stemming from a traumatic birth that left him with a permanently withered and useless left arm, he overcompensated with a bombastic, hyper-masculine posture. He was obsessed with military regalia, constantly designing new uniforms and appearing in public in an endless variety of martial attire. His public pronouncements, often made without consulting his ministers, were infamous for their aggressive and undiplomatic tone, unsettling foreign governments and exasperating his own. Yet to his people he was the symbol of the new Germany, powerful, modern, and unapologetic. He saw himself as a monarch by divine right, a patriarch to his nation, a warlord in the tradition of his ancestors. He was the all-highest, and his influence over the court, the government, and especially his own family was absolute. The young prince's father was Crown Prince Wilhelm, a man who lived perpetually in the shadow of his formidable parent. Where the Kaiser was often stern, bombastic, and overbearing, the Crown Prince was seen by the public as more charming, dashing, and approachable. A skilled horseman and sportsman, his lean, athletic figure and fashionable appearance made him a popular society figure, but also earned him a reputation as a lightweight, a playboy prince. His relationship with his father was fraught with tension, a classic struggle between an overpowering patriarch and a son seeking his own identity. While he held high command during the First World War, leading the Fifth Army at the infamous Battle of Verdun, his military reputation remained contested. He lacked his father's intellectual depth, but also his dangerous instability. He represented a more modern, less formal style of royalty, yet he too was a product of the same rigid system, a man whose primary purpose was to wait. The prince's mother, Crown Princess Cecilia of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, provided the warmth and stability often lacking in the formal Hohenzollern court. Renowned for her striking beauty, impeccable style, and graceful demeanor, she was one of the most popular members of the royal family. She created a more relaxed and nurturing atmosphere for her children than was typical in royal Prussian households, attempting to carve out a space for a genuine family life amidst the crushing demands of public duty and dynastic expectation. The young Wilhelm, or Wimpy as he was known within the intimate family circle, spent his first years in this gilded cage, an existence of unimaginable privilege governed by an ironclad routine. His life was a carefully orchestrated performance of royal duty, moving between the magnificent royal residences that dotted Potsdam and Berlin. He played in the sprawling fairy tale parks of Sanssouci, a landscape designed by his ancestor Frederick the Great, to project an image of enlightened, absolute power. He lived in the Marmor Palais, a jewel of early classicism, and later in the Neue Palais, a colossal Baroque palace built to celebrate the end of the 7 Years' War, its scale intended to awe and intimidate. He learned to ride, to shoot, and to sail, the essential accomplishments of a Prussian prince. His education was not intended to foster critical thinking or individual creativity. It was designed to forge an emperor. He was shielded from the outside world, educated by a team of private tutors who meticulously planned every hour of his day. The curriculum was heavy on history, specifically the glorious history of the House of Hohenzollern, as well as languages, military science, and religion. He was taught that he was born to rule and that this right was bestowed by God. The central tenet of his upbringing was the concept of duty, the idea that his personal desires and feelings were entirely subordinate to the needs of the dynasty and the state. He was not being raised as a person, but as a future component of the imperial machinery. The most potent element of this indoctrination was the cult of the military. From his earliest childhood, he was dressed in sailor suits and miniature uniforms. The defining moment of his youth came in 1916, in the midst of the First World War. At just 10 years old, in a ceremony presided over by his grandfather, the Kaiser, he was formally commissioned as an honorary second lieutenant in the 1st Regiment of Foot Guards, Erste Gardregiment zu Fuß. This was not just any regiment. It was the most prestigious and socially exclusive unit in the entire Prussian army, its history inextricably linked with the rise of the Hohenzollerns. To be an officer in the 1st Foot Guards was the highest aspiration of any young Prussian nobleman. Official photographs of this event were distributed throughout the empire. They show a small, serious-looking boy almost swallowed by a perfectly tailored gray uniform, complete with a miniature Pickelhaube, spiked helmet, and a small sword. These images were powerful propaganda. At a time when the nation was bleeding on the battlefields of France and Russia, the photograph of the young prince in uniform was a living promise of continuity. It sent a clear message. The dynasty was eternal. The sacrifices of the present were for the sake of a guaranteed future, and the next generation was already prepared to take its place in the line of duty. For the young prince himself, this ceremony was the formalization of his destiny. His identity was now fused with the army. He was a soldier before he was a teenager, a future warlord before he had finished his school books. He and his younger brothers were raised to be tough, in the Spartan tradition of the Prussian court. The Kaiser, deeply sensitive about his own physical disability, was determined that his heirs should be paragons of masculine strength and military bearing. Displays of emotion were discouraged. Hardship was to be endured without complaint. The prince's childhood, for all its opulence, was emotionally austere, a world where love and affection were often expressed through the shared rituals of military tradition rather than through simple intimacy. He grew up in a world where his grandfather was the center of the universe. His father was the heir in waiting, and he was the next link in an unbreakable golden chain stretching back through centuries of German history. Every aspect of his life was meticulously planned, from the cradle to the throne. He was the future of Germany, a future that seemed as bright, as powerful, and as certain as the German Empire itself. And then, in a blink of historical time, that future was utterly and completely annihilated. The year 1918 brought not the promised victory, but a catastrophic and humiliating defeat. The war was lost, the German people were starving, and the home front was collapsing into chaos. A revolution, born of desperation and war weariness, swept the country, Sailors in the high seas fleet, the Kaiser's pride and joy, mutinied in Kiel. Workers' and soldiers' councils, modeled on the Soviet system, sprang up in cities across the nation. The old order crumbled with breathtaking speed. On the 9th of November, with Berlin on the brink of a full-scale uprising, Kaiser Wilhelm II, facing the total collapse of his government and the loss of his army's loyalty, was forced to abdicate. He boarded a special train to the neutral Netherlands, slipping across the border into a lifetime of exile and political irrelevance. In a single day, 1,000 years of German monarchy and 500 years of Hohenzollern rule in Prussia ended in collapse, recrimination, and humiliation. For 12-year-old Prince Wilhelm, this was not merely a political event to be read about in a history book. It was a personal apocalypse. The entire foundation of his identity, the very purpose of his existence, had vanished overnight. The certain world he had known, the world of palaces, parades, and deference, was gone. He was no longer a future emperor. He was suddenly the son of a disgraced and widely blamed crown prince, and the grandson of a hated and exiled Kaiser, a figure whom Allied propaganda had successfully demonized as the architect of the war. He had to stand by and watch as the legacy his family had built over centuries was dismantled, its powerful symbols torn down, its glorious palaces turned into public museums. This profound and premature experience of loss, this theft of a promised destiny, became the defining trauma of his life. He was the ultimate victim of an overturned world, a boy who had lost a kingdom before he was old enough to properly understand what it meant to rule it. The sense of being the failed heir, the one who inherited nothing but a famous name and a collection of painful memories, would haunt him for the rest of his short, tragic life. The golden chain had been broken. The collapse of the German Empire in November 1918 was not a gentle transition. It was a violent, shattering amputation. For 12-year-old Prince Wilhelm, the world did not just change, it ceased to exist. He and his family were cast adrift in a new, terrifying, and utterly alien reality, the Weimar Republic. The Germany that emerged from the ashes of defeat was a nation convulsed by trauma and rage. It was a republic born of failure, a democratic experiment conducted in a laboratory of political chaos, economic destitution, and profound national humiliation. For the Hohenzollern family, this was a time of bewildering descent. They were no longer the anointed rulers of a mighty empire. They were private citizens, stripped of their power and privileges, bearing a name that was, for millions, synonymous with the catastrophe of the Great War. While the old Kaiser fumed in his Dutch exile, writing furious self-exculpatory memoirs, and the crown prince was interned on the island of Wieringen until 1923. The rest of the family, including the young Wilhelm and his mother, Crown Princess Cecilia, had to learn to navigate this treacherous new landscape. They were forced to negotiate with the new social democratic government for their property and possessions, a humiliating process that saw their vast network of palaces, estates, and art collections become a subject of bitter public debate. They were transformed overnight into symbols. For the monarchist and nationalist right, they were living martyrs, a reminder of a glorious past. For the Republican center and the communist left, they were parasites, specters of a reactionary and militaristic order that had to be exorcised for the nation to heal. For the young prince, the gilded cage of his childhood was abruptly dismantled, replaced by a life of shocking and unwelcome normality. In a move that would have been unthinkable just a few years prior, he was enrolled not with a team of private tutors in a secluded palace, but at the Real Gymnasium in Potsdam, a public high school. The boy who was meant to command a nation now sat in a classroom, shoulder to shoulder, with the sons of merchants, civil servants, and army officers. This experience was a brutal immersion into a world from which he had been meticulously shielded. He, who had known only the deference and protocol of the court, now had to contend with the casual cruelty and camaraderie of schoolboys. It was here that he first learned, in the most direct way possible, that his name was no longer a shield but a target, a label that invited both whispered reverence and open contempt. The classroom became a microcosm of divided Germany itself. Some classmates, the sons of ardent Republicans or socialists, regarded him with contempt, whispering derisive nicknames behind his back, Little Kaiser or the Fallen Prince. They saw him as a living relic of a regime that had sent their fathers and brothers into the slaughterhouse of the war. Yet there were others, the sons of former officers or monarchist families, who treated him with a stiff and awkward reverence. They would offer clumsy bows as he passed, using formal titles that were jarringly out of place in the noisy schoolyard. Both extremes created an invisible wall. The mockery put him on guard, while the reverence prevented any genuine camaraderie. He was not just another boy, and the public school, rather than integrating him into society, only deepened his sense of isolation and otherness. He learned to shield his feelings behind a cool, aristocratic reserve, a defense mechanism that would define his character in the years to come. This period forged in him a complex mixture of aristocratic reserve and a deep-seated awareness of his own precarious position. After completing his secondary education, he embarked on the traditional path for a young man of his class, studying law and political science at the universities of Königsberg, Munich, and Bonn. These were not tranquil ivory towers. In the 1920s, German universities were seething cauldrons of political extremism, battlegrounds for the soul of the nation, where monarchist, fascist, communist, and Republican student groups clashed, often violently. It was during this formative period that Wilhelm sought to forge an identity for himself, torn between the ghost of his royal past and the uncertainty of his Republican present. He made a choice that would define his political orientation and set the stage for a national scandal. He joined the Corps Borussia Bonn, one of Germany's most prestigious and traditional student fraternities. To join a Studentenverbindung, or student corps, was to enter a lifelong brotherhood defined by rigid codes of honor, ritualized drinking, and most famously the practice of academic fencing, the Mensur. This was a duel with sharpened blades in which the goal was not to injure the opponent but to stand one's ground and accept any resulting facial scars as a badge of honor. The Corps Borussia Bonn was the most elite of these fraternities, its membership historically drawn from the highest echelons of the Prussian aristocracy, including the Kaiser and the Crown Prince themselves. By joining Borussia, Wilhelm was sending an unambiguous signal. He was turning his back on the new Republican order and reaffirming his allegiance to the values, traditions, and social networks of the old elite. He was choosing to live in the Germany of yesterday. It was within this hyper-masculine world of tradition and honor that he found a sense of belonging that the new Germany had denied him. But it was also a choice that would soon catapult him from relative obscurity into the center of a raging political firestorm. The year was 1926. The Weimar Republic, having survived the hyperinflation and political violence of its early years, was in the midst of a period of precarious stability known as the Golden Twenties. Yet beneath the veneer of cultural vibrancy and economic recovery, the old wounds had not healed. The German army, the Reichswehr, limited by the Treaty of Versailles to a mere 100,000 men, existed as a state within a state. Its commander, the brilliant and enigmatic General Hans von Seeckt, was an aristocrat and a monarchist at heart. While he officially served the Republic, he worked tirelessly to preserve the doctrines, traditions, and, most importantly, the elitist spirit of the old imperial army, seeing the Reichswehr as the true guardian of the nation's soul, patiently waiting for the day when the decadent Republican experiment would collapse. It was Seeckt who made the fateful decision to authorize the 20-year-old Prince Wilhelm's attendance at a major military maneuver of the 9th Infantry Regiment. For the prince, it was likely intended as a gesture of sentimental pride, a tribute to his family's deep and abiding connection to the army, the institution they revered above all others. He did not attend as a civilian spectator. He arrived in a move of breathtaking political naivety or deliberate provocation, wearing the full, pre-war imperial dress uniform of his old honorary regiment, the 1st Foot Guards. Imagine the scene. Amidst the field gray utilitarian uniforms of the Republican Reichswehr, a ghost appeared. The uniform of the 1st Foot Guards was a magnificent and potent symbol of the fallen monarchy. With its dark blue tunic, gleaming silver gorget, and, most strikingly, the towering silver mitre cap adorned with a golden eagle, it was a piece of pure Baroque theater designed to evoke the glory of Frederick the Great. The image of the former heir, the Kaiser's grandson, resplendent in this anachronistic finery at an official event of the Republican Army, was a match thrown into a powder keg. The scandal exploded in the press. For the left-wing and Republican newspapers, it was the ultimate proof of their deepest fears, that the army, which was supposed to be a pillar of the new democratic state, was rotten with monarchist sentiment and actively plotting a return to the old regime. The Social Democratic Party, SPD, a key partner in the governing coalition, was outraged. They saw the prince's presence in that uniform as an intolerable insult to the Republic and a direct challenge to civilian authority over the military. The uniform scandal, as it became known, dominated the headlines and triggered a ferocious debate in the Reichstag. The crisis reached the very top of the government, forcing the powerful, hitherto untouchable General von Seeckt to resign his command. For Wilhelm himself, this political firestorm was a harsh and bewildering blow. His action had not stemmed from a deep political calculation, but from a romantic naivety. To him, wearing the uniform of the 1st Foot Guards was not an act of provocation against the Republic. It was a sacred gesture of reverence for his family, for the army, and for a heritage he had been taught to value above life itself. The ferocious reaction from the press and politicians left him stunned. He felt no regret for his actions, but rather a bitter anger and profound sense of disillusionment. By all accounts, he felt grossly misunderstood. In his eyes, it was the Republic that was the offender for politicizing a symbol of honor and turning an act of remembrance into a crime. The scandal did not teach him a lesson in political prudence. It only pushed him further away, hardening his resolve to find his belonging in the lost world of yesterday. Overnight, the affair transformed Prince Wilhelm. He was no longer just a dispossessed royal, a footnote in the society pages. He was now a potent symbol of conservative resistance, a hero to the monarchists and nationalists who dreamed of overthrowing the November criminals and restoring the monarchy, and a villain to the defenders of the fragile Republic. The scandal was a defining moment. It starkly revealed his own lack of political judgment, but it also exposed the deep, unhealed chasm that ran through German society. More importantly, it pushed him into a corner, branding him as a reactionary figurehead and forever alienating him from the political mainstream. He had attempted to honor a dead past and, in doing so, had become an enemy of the living present. Having rebelled, perhaps unwittingly, against the Republic, his personal life would soon lead him to rebel against his own dynasty. During his university years, in the midst of this political turmoil, he found an anchor in a world that sought to cast him adrift. He fell deeply and irrevocably in love with a young woman named Dorothea von Salviati. They met at a university ball in Bonn, a social event that for Wilhelm was usually an exercise in enduring stiff reverence or curious whispers. He was used to people being either overly deferential to his name or trying to impress him. But Dorothea was different. When introduced, she met his gaze directly with a calm, intelligent look, devoid of any flutter of either nervousness or flattery. Their conversation did not revolve around his family's gilded past or the politics of the Republic. Instead, she asked him about his law lectures, about the books he was reading, about his opinions on the philosophers they were both studying. For a man who had been seen as a symbol his entire life, to be treated as an intellect, as a peer, was disarming and captivating. It was her normalcy, her unflinching directness, and her genuine interest in the man, not the name he carried, that pierced the defensive shell he had built around himself during his public school years. Their relationship became the refuge he had craved. Their most precious moments were spent on quiet walks through the parks of Sanssouci, a poetic irony that they found their private peace amidst the grandest legacy of his ancestors. There, among the gardens and temples built to project power, Wilhelm was no longer the Hohenzollern heir. He was simply Wilhelm, walking beside the woman he loved. They spoke of ordinary things, of a future they might build together, of raising children away from the weight of history, of simple joys like music and nature. With Dorothea, he could laugh freely and share the private fears he never dared show his family. Every conversation, every quiet moment with her, affirmed a growing truth within him. The real, tangible happiness he felt by her side was worth more than any phantom throne. This was not mere infatuation, it was liberation. Dorothea had not just captured his heart, she had given him back to himself. But in the rigid, almost theological calculus of European royalty, there was a crucial and insurmountable distinction. Her family, while noble with a long history of service to the Prussian state, was part of the niederer Adel, the minor or lower nobility. They were not members of the Hochadel, the small sacred circle of high ruling or formerly ruling houses from which a future Kaiserin had to be chosen. For the ancient and unbending dynastic laws of the House of Hohenzollern, this was not a social inconvenience, it was an existential threat. A marriage to her would be considered a morganatic marriage, a union with a person of unequal status. Such a marriage would mean that she could never share his titles or rank, and, most critically, any children they had would be automatically and permanently disqualified from all rights of succession. The news of the romance traveled quickly to the head of the family, the exiled and aging Kaiser Wilhelm II, who watched over his dynasty's fate from his grand manor at Huisdoorn in the Netherlands. The response was not one of grandfatherly concern for a young man's happiness, but of dynastic fury. From his gilded cage of exile, the old Kaiser still ruled the House of Hohenzollern with an iron fist. He saw himself not as a retired monarch, but as the guardian of a sacred trust, a bloodline that had been passed down through centuries. Even with the throne gone, the purity of that bloodline and the sanctity of the house laws were paramount. To him, the throne was not lost, merely vacant, and the duty of every member of the family was to keep themselves pure and ready for a potential restoration. A torrent of letters, orders, and emissaries flowed from Dorn to Germany. The Kaiser brought immense pressure to bear on his grandson. He threatened, he pleaded, he commanded. He reminded Wilhelm of his duty, of the sacrifices of their ancestors, of the glorious history he was about to betray for a mere infatuation. The Crown Prince, caught between his imperious father and his determined son, was largely ineffective. The message from the old Kaiser was implacable: end the relationship or be cast out. Prince Wilhelm now faced an impossible choice, a dilemma that went to the very core of his identity. On one side was his dynastic duty, the entire purpose of his upbringing, the very reason for his existence. To obey meant preserving his place in the line of succession, maintaining the fantasy of a restored monarchy, and keeping the peace within his fractured family. It meant remaining a symbol, a link in an unbreakable golden chain. On the other side was his personal happiness with the woman he loved. To choose her meant defying his grandfather, the patriarch and former emperor. It meant publicly declaring that the dream of restoration was less important than his own life. It meant shattering the myth his family had clung to since 1918. Was he a prince of a ghostly empire, or was he a man? Was his life his own, or did it belong to the weight of a name? He was wrestling not just with his grandfather, but with the ghost of Frederick the Great, with the stern gaze of the soldier king, with 500 years of Hohenzollern history. His entire education, every uniform he had worn, every salute he had received, had been designed to prepare him for this kind of sacrifice, to put the state and the dynasty before the self. In a decision that would define the rest of his life, he chose love. On June 3, 1933, in a relatively modest ceremony in Bonn, he married Dorothea von Salviati. It was a quiet, solemn act of liberation. In doing so, he officially signed a document renouncing all rights of succession for himself and for any future children. It was the ultimate act of self-determination in a life that had been defined by a pre-written script. Having already lost a throne to a revolution, he now willingly and formally gave up his claim to it for the sake of his own heart. The decision created a deep and lasting rift with his powerful grandfather and alienated him from the more ambitious, restoration-minded members of his own family. He had become a rebel twice over, first against the republic that had taken his birthright, and now against the dynasty that sought to control his life. He was a man who belonged nowhere, an heir to nothing, finally free but utterly adrift. The year of this momentous personal decision, 1933, was also the year that Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party came to power, ushering in the darkest chapter in German history. As Germany was shackling itself to a new and brutal tyranny, Prince Wilhelm was casting off his own gilded chains. The chaotic, vibrant, and fatally flawed democratic experiment of the Weimar Republic was over. For the prince, the personal freedom he had just secured would soon be overshadowed by the rise of a new, all-encompassing despotism that would ultimately demand his service and claim his life. The year 1933 was a year of profound endings and terrifying beginnings. For Prince Wilhelm of Prussia, it was the year he achieved a measure of personal freedom, formally renouncing his dynastic claims to marry the woman he loved. For Germany, it was the year its fragile democratic experiment was extinguished, and Adolf Hitler became chancellor. The two events, one deeply personal and the other epoch-defining, were inextricably linked. The rise of the Nazi Party presented the German aristocracy, and the House of Hohenzollern in particular, with a complex and ultimately fatal dilemma. In the vulgar, brown-shirted thugs of the Nazi movement, Many in the old elite saw not a mortal threat, but a potential, if distasteful, tool. It was a miscalculation of historic proportions, a Faustian bargain that they would enter into with a disastrous naivety, and from which they would never recover. To understand this tragic misjudgment, one must understand the psyche of the German conservative establishment in the early 1930s. They were a class that had been dispossessed and humiliated by the Weimar Republic. They despised its democratic politics, its liberal social values, and its perceived weakness on the international stage. Their greatest fear was a Bolshevik-style communist revolution, which they saw as an existential threat to their property, their faith, and their entire way of life. In Hitler, they saw a man who shared their hatreds. He was a virulent anti-communist, a fervent nationalist who promised to tear up the hated Treaty of Versailles and restore Germany's military might. His authoritarianism appealed to their own deeply ingrained belief in order, discipline, and hierarchical leadership. The prevailing belief among many influential aristocrats, industrialists, and old guard politicians was that Hitler was a temporary, manageable phenomenon. They saw him as a vulgar but effective rabble-rouser, a drummer who could rally the masses and crush the political left. Once he had served this purpose, they believed he could be tamed, controlled, and eventually sidelined, paving the way for a more traditional authoritarian state, perhaps even a restored monarchy. Franz von Papen, the aristocratic former chancellor who was instrumental in persuading President von Hindenburg to appoint Hitler, famously remarked, "In 2 months, we will have pushed Hitler into a corner so hard that he'll be squeaking." It was perhaps the single greatest political miscalculation of the 20th century. No one embodied this fatal miscalculation more than Prince Wilhelm's own father, the former Crown Prince. Bored by a life of political irrelevance and yearning for a return to national prominence, he was dangerously susceptible to the Nazis' promises of a renewed Germany. He was actively courted by figures like Hermann Göring, a former World War I flying ace who could bridge the gap between the old military aristocracy and the new party leadership. Göring often postured as a closet monarchist, assuring the Crown Prince and his circle that Hitler's movement was merely a blunt instrument. Their shared arrogant belief was that Hitler, the vulgar drummer, would rally the masses and brutally crush the communists. Once that dirty work was done, they theorized, the traditional elite, the army, the industrialists, and the aristocracy would sideline him, restore order, and pave the way for a return of the monarchy. The Crown Prince, therefore, willingly lent his image to the Nazi cause, meeting with Hitler and appearing at rallies. For the Nazis, it was a priceless propaganda victory, wrapping their radical movement in the respectable flag of the old empire. For the Crown Prince, it was the first step in a Faustian bargain whose terms he had failed to comprehend. The payment for that bargain came due in the blood-soaked summer of 1934. On the night of the Long Knives, Hitler ordered the systematic liquidation of the leadership of the SA, his own brown-shirted stormtroopers, whose leader, Ernst Röhm, he now saw as a rival. But the purge went far beyond an internal party squabble. It was a weekend of bloody score settling, where the SS, Hitler's black-clad Praetorian Guard, hunted down and murdered hundreds of political opponents. Crucially, the victims included prominent figures from the old conservative and monarchist camp. The news spread not through newspapers, but in panicked phone calls and hushed conversations in the manors of Prussia and the gentlemen's clubs of Berlin. When former Chancellor General Kurt von Schleicher and his wife were machine-gunned in their home, the aristocracy felt a tremor of genuine terror. These were not anonymous street brawlers being eliminated, Schleicher was one of their own. In that single weekend, their dream of controlling Hitler evaporated, replaced by a horrifying realization. They were not partners in a national revival. They were hostages to a murderous regime that held them in utter contempt. The brutal efficiency of the SS demonstrated that any form of opposition was now a death sentence. A fearful silence fell over the conservative elite, who now understood they had helped unleash a monster they could not control, and their earlier complicity had left them both morally disarmed and hopelessly trapped. The Night of the Long Knives sent a wave of icy terror through the German aristocracy. It was a brutal and unambiguous message. No one was safe. Hitler would not be controlled, and any perceived threat or rival center of power would be ruthlessly eliminated. The dream of using the Nazis as a stepping stone to a monarchical restoration died in that bloody weekend. The old elite now understood that they were not partners in a national revival. They were subjects of a totalitarian regime that held them in contempt. But it was far too late. They were trapped. The state had become a finely tuned instrument of terror, and any open opposition was a death sentence. The Hohenzollerns, having lent their name and prestige to the regime in its early days, were now forced into a position of silent, fearful compliance. After his marriage, and in the wake of this chilling political turn, Prince Wilhelm attempted to retreat from the public eye and build a quiet life with Dorothea. He sought the obscurity of a country gentleman, a life that his class had idealized for centuries. They had two daughters, Felicitas, born in 1934, and Christa, born in 1936. They moved between family estates, trying to create a small island of domestic peace in a nation being rapidly reshaped by fanaticism and fear. But such a life could not truly suit a man like Wilhelm. He was a Hohenzollern. The call of military duty, the very essence of his family's identity for over 500 years, was in his blood. He had been raised from birth to believe that the highest calling for a prince was to serve the nation as a soldier. Life as a provincial squire, managing farms and raising a family, left him with a profound sense of purposelessness. In the disciplined hierarchical world of the army, he could find the structure, the sense of belonging, and the clear-cut purpose that had been stolen from him in 1918. As the 1930s wore on and Hitler's aggressive foreign policy made war increasingly inevitable, Wilhelm saw a path back to a life of meaning. When Hitler invaded Poland in September 1939, triggering the Second World War, there was no question for Prince Wilhelm of what he must do. Along with tens of thousands of other men from the German aristocracy, he immediately volunteered for service in the German army, the Wehrmacht. For these men, it was a matter of patriotic duty that transcended their personal feelings about the Nazi regime. They were serving Germany, not Hitler, a distinction they held to in their own minds, however flawed it may have been. Wilhelm was commissioned as an Oberleutnant, a first lieutenant, and assigned to the 23rd Infantry Division. He was not given a safe ceremonial post at a general's headquarters. He was a combat officer destined for the front lines. He was determined to prove his worth, to live up to the legacy of his ancestors, and to fulfill, in the only way now possible, the military destiny for which he had been groomed from birth. When First Lieutenant Wilhelm joined his unit, he was met by the men under his command with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. To these hardened infantrymen, the name von Preußen sounded like an echo from another world. Initially, they saw him as more of a symbolic figure than a commander. But Wilhelm quickly dispelled those notions, not with words, but with actions. He was a thoroughly professional officer who knew his drills and expected discipline, but who was always fair. More importantly, he never demanded special privileges. He shared their meager rations, slept in the same cold mud, and endured the same grueling marches as any other soldier. His men saw in him a deeply ingrained sense of duty, a quiet commitment to his role that earned their respect. Slowly, the whispers about the prince faded, replaced by a growing trust in their leader. He was no longer a distant symbol, but our lieutenant, a true soldier who had chosen to be on the front line with them. In May 1940, the phony war in the West came to a dramatic end as German forces launched their blitzkrieg against France and the Low Countries. Wilhelm's division was part of the massive armored thrust that smashed through the Allied lines. In the third week of May, near the city of Valenciennes in northern France, his unit was engaged in fierce and brutal fighting. The combat was not the sweeping, glorious warfare of 19th century paintings. It was a desperate, ugly struggle for control of villages and street corners. On May 23rd, during a vicious street battle, Prince Wilhelm was leading his men in an assault when he was hit by enemy fire and gravely wounded. He was evacuated from the chaos of the front to a German field hospital set up in Nivelles, Belgium. The surgeons did what they could, but his injuries were too severe. For 3 days he lingered between life and death. On May 26, 1940, Prince Wilhelm of Prussia, grandson of the last German emperor, died. He was just 33 years old. His death was the final crushing irony of a life defined by paradox. Born to inherit one of the most powerful empires on earth, he died a junior officer. Groomed to be the supreme warlord of the German army, he died in its service, but under the command of a regime that despised his family and everything they stood for. He had sought purpose in the one institution his family had always trusted, the army, only to become a casualty in a war of conquest, waged by a criminal clique that had perverted every Prussian value he held dear. He had renounced a non-existent throne for love, only to sacrifice his life for a nation that had been twisted into a monstrous caricature of the one he was born to rule. The news of his death, the first German prince to fall in the war, was not suppressed. It was announced officially and spread like wildfire through the Reich. For a public that had been fed a steady diet of heroic but often anonymous military deaths, the passing of the Kaiser's grandson had a unique and powerful resonance. His body was prepared for its final journey home, back to Potsdam, the city of his birth, the heartland of the Hohenzollern legend. No one, not the Nazi authorities, and not even his own family, could have anticipated what would happen next. His death, a personal tragedy on a distant battlefield, was about to become a major political event, a silent and powerful referendum on the new order, bringing the story full circle back to the astonishing funeral that would reveal the deep, unhealed wounds of the German nation. The journey of Prince Wilhelm's body from the field hospital in Belgium back to Potsdam was a slow, somber procession through a nation at the peak of its military triumph. As the funeral train crossed the German border and wound its way eastward, a strange phenomenon occurred. At stations and railway crossings, small, silent crowds gathered. Word had spread through unofficial channels, a whisper network that still existed beneath the din of state propaganda. They stood in respectful silence, men removing their hats as the carriage bearing the coffin passed. It was a quiet, unorganized, and deeply personal display of mourning, a prelude to the astonishing event that was to unfold in the old royal city. The Nazi authorities, including propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, were aware of the prince's death and the planned funeral. In their hubris, they likely saw it as a minor event, perhaps even a useful one. The death of a Hohenzollern prince fighting for the Reich could be spun as a powerful symbol of national unity, a demonstration that the old aristocracy and the new Nazi order were fighting and dying together for the fatherland. They planned for a standard military funeral, an honorable but controlled affair that would be noted in the papers and then fade into memory. They had catastrophically misjudged the mood of the people and the enduring power of a name. What happened in Potsdam on May 29, 1940, was not a funeral. It was a resurrection. For a few brief hours, the ghost of Imperial Germany, a specter the Nazis believed they had long since buried, rose and walked the streets. The 50,000 people who inundated the city were not there to mourn a soldier of the Third Reich. They were there to mourn their Kaiser's grandson. Their presence was one of the largest non-state organized public gatherings of the entire Nazi era, and its silence was more eloquent and more damning than any speech. It was an act of collective memory, a spontaneous pilgrimage to a past that the current regime was trying to erase. Each person in that crowd had their own reason for being there, a tapestry of motivations that, when woven together, created a profound and dangerous counter-narrative to the triumphant pageant of Nazism. There were the old monarchists, the true believers, for whom this was a day of genuine grief. They saw in the coffin the death of a dream, the final tragic end to the hope of a Hohenzollern restoration. For them, Wilhelm was not just a man, he was the future they had lost, and his death felt like a divine judgment on a godless age. There were the veterans of the Great War, men who had fought under the imperial standard and saw in the prince a connection to their own sacrifices, a symbol of the honorable professional army they had belonged to, which they contrasted with the politicized, brown-shirted thuggery of the Nazi movement. Their presence was an act of loyalty to the old army and a quiet rebuke to the new one. But the crowd was much larger than just these committed groups. It was filled with ordinary citizens, people who may have held no strong monarchist convictions, but who felt a deep-seated unease with the Nazi regime. For them, the funeral was a rare opportunity for safe protest. In a state where a misplaced word could lead to a concentration camp, the act of mourning a prince was politically ambiguous. It could be explained as simple patriotism, yet everyone understood its deeper meaning. It was a vote with one's feet against the vulgarity of the Nazi leadership, against their pagan rituals that sought to replace Christian traditions, against the constant hysterical noise of propaganda. The quiet, dignified, and profoundly traditional Christian ceremony was an oasis of old-world solemnity in a desert of fascist kitsch. The sight of the old imperial flag, black and white, with the Prussian eagle draped over the coffin, was a powerful visual repudiation of the swastika. The procession made its way through the hushed streets to the Church of Peace, itself a potent symbol. Nestled in the gardens of Sanssouci, it was an intimate Italian-style church commissioned by King Frederick William IV, the romantic on the throne. It was a place of quiet contemplation, far removed from the cold, monumental gigantism of Nazi architectural plans. As the prince's coffin was carried into the church, and then to its final resting place in the antique temple in the park, the silent demonstration of 50,000 people sent a shockwave through the Nazi hierarchy. The Gestapo and local party officials, who had been observing the event with growing alarm, sent frantic reports to Berlin. The message was clear. A dangerous and deeply rooted sentiment had revealed itself. In his headquarters, far from the quiet grief of Potsdam, Adolf Hitler's reaction was one of pure fury. The funeral was a personal affront, a direct challenge to his carefully constructed mythos as the sole embodiment of the German nation's will. He was a man deeply insecure about his own legitimacy. He had come to power through backroom deals and intimidation, and he ruled by terror and propaganda. He craved the kind of organic historical legitimacy that the Hohenzollerns possessed by birthright, a legitimacy he could only mimic. The reverence shown for the dead prince proved that this alternative center of loyalty was not dead. It was merely dormant. He saw with the paranoid clarity of a true tyrant that the dead Prince Wilhelm was now more dangerous to his authority than he had ever been in life. A royal martyr, especially a handsome young soldier, could become a powerful rallying point for the conservative and military circles that Hitler still did not fully trust. He would not allow it to happen again. Shortly after the funeral, Hitler issued a secret decree that would become known as the Prinzenerlass, the Decree on Princes. The order was direct and unambiguous. All members of Germany's former ruling houses were strictly forbidden from serving in combat roles in the Wehrmacht. Princes currently at the front were to be withdrawn and reassigned to rear echelon positions. The official justification was that the death of such prominent figures was damaging to public morale, but the real reason was political. Hitler was severing the connection between the old aristocracy and the military, an institution he was still in the process of bending to his will. He would not risk the creation of any more royal martyrs whose funerals could become silent monarchist protests. The Prinzenerlass was a major political turning point. It marked the formal final break between the Nazi regime and the old German aristocracy. The Faustian bargain was over. The nobles whom Hitler had courted and exploited for their prestige in the early years were now officially branded as politically unreliable, a class to be controlled, marginalized, and eventually eliminated. The path to any kind of royal restoration, already a fantasy, was now permanently and irrevocably closed. The quiet grief of 50,000 people in a Potsdam park had provoked the tyrant into showing his hand, and in doing so, he had extinguished the last flickering flame of a 1,000-year-old tradition. The legacy of Prince Wilhelm of Prussia lies not in political or military achievements, but in his tragic life itself, a microcosm of the fate of his family, his class, and his nation. Born to inherit an empire, he witnessed its collapse as a teenager and became a living symbol of a lost past in the Weimar Republic. He sought purpose in the military, but ultimately died in service to a brutal regime that contradicted his values. His death unexpectedly revealed that the allure of the old monarchy still persisted in Germany, despite Nazi propaganda, exposing a longing for a different kind of Germany. In essence, his story is a deeply human one, about a man burdened by a name too great to carry. In a life defined by loss, his only act of self-determination was to renounce his distant claim to the throne, to marry for love, choosing personal happiness over being a symbol. His life was not the story of a king, but a profound cautionary tale about the fate of an heir when the world they were born to rule vanishes, leaving them with nothing but a ghostly legacy.